Good. Thank you very much, Alan. And so as Alan said, now we're moving on to the actual meat of the workshop. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is in fact Adrian Bowen. It's been mentioned already a couple of times. I have the pleasure of knowing Adrian for quite a long time. I don't even want to say how long, or it will date both of us, but Adrian was a postdoc here when I just finished my postdoc here, so it wasn't so far along. And at the time, Adrian was working with Michael Petrides, who's here, and Brenda Milner, and he did some of the really important work looking at the different functional properties of the frontal cortex. Really quite important work. And then he went back to the UK for a number of years, where he worked primarily at Cambridge University. And I won't give you his whole biography because we would really be here all day. But I think what's important to know is that, well, first of all, that he was seduced into coming back to Canada by Mel Goodale and Western. Thanks to Canada Research Chair that he was offered. And ever since then, he's continued to do a great deal of work in many different domains of cognitive neuroscience. But he's probably best known for some really, really original and seminal work that he did, I guess, starting about 12 years ago or so, 15 years ago, looking at people in minimally conscious states. And the breakthrough was really to be able to demonstrate that in some individuals who are seemingly completely unable to communicate, and therefore it had been assumed that they have no consciousness going on, Adrian was able to demonstrate that indeed, with the right kind of brain imaging measures and with the right kind of cognitive tasks, you can actually demonstrate that those individuals do have conscious processing. And not only that, but that one can communicate with them indirectly by looking at the pattern of brain activity and using that as the output, if you will, to be able to have them answer questions, for instance. And this work has really been, like I said, really seminal, essentially, in starting a whole new field of research, which is this concept upon which the workshop today is sort of focused, which is the idea that you can decode mental states, even people who may not be able to communicate. And there are, of course, enormous ethical and societal implications to that, as well as scientific and philosophical questions that arise. A lot of Adrian's work has really focused on fMRI, but also more recently, he's been using other techniques, and we're lucky to have a bunch of his students here who will tell us about some of the real cutting-edge stuff that they're doing. And one other thing I have to say is that you should really read his incredibly cool book. And I'm not getting any, benefit from this, am I? Maybe you'll buy me a drink. But anyway, this is a fantastic book that just came out recently, Into the Gray Zone. And it is really about this whole issue of what does it mean to have different conscious states and how do we probe it? And it's a highly readable book. I strongly recommend it. And I would like everyone to welcome Adrian to give his lecture.
Is we got first healthy participants and then a single vegetative state patient to imagine playing a game of tennis. And this produced, we were essentially just using this as a mechanism to get the patient to think about waving her arms around. And what we saw is a very similar pattern of activity in the medial premotor region. We then switched tasks and we asked the patient and our healthy participants to imagine walking from room to room in their house, a simple spatial navigation task. And again, as you can see, we saw a very similar pattern of activity in the patient who at this point had not produced any physical responses to an external prompt for about 5 months. Yet when we said play tennis, she would produce a pattern of brain activity like the healthy participants. When we said, imagine moving around your house, again, she would produce a different pattern of brain activity, which was, again, like healthy participants. Now, this is a sort of decoding of mental states. It's really rather rudimentary, but if you think about it, if in this context, if we see premotor activity, she is imagining playing tennis. So in that sense, we're decoding her mental state. And if we see, say, parahippocampal gyrus activity, then we know that she is imagining moving from room to room in her house. And again, in that sense, we're decoding her mental state. But this is a very sort of constrained situation. We only gave her 2 states. So we're kind of, it's a binary problem. We're saying which we are able to determine which of these 2 things she's doing. We're not really decoding her mental state. Now, I'm going to come back to that point a little bit later. But of course, back in 2006, we weren't really interested in this. We were interested in working out whether she was conscious and aware of the situation that she was in. And we felt very strongly that we were able to do that. And there's various bits of evidence came together to allow us to draw that conclusion. One is from the pattern of her brain activity over the 5 minutes of the scan. This is each of these is a 30-second epoch. This is just looking at the premotor cortex, relaxing, imagining playing tennis, relaxing, imagining playing tennis. And it's pretty convincing that she's switching this activity on and off every time we ask her to change what she's thinking about. Again, another sense in which we are decoding her thoughts. But of course, we are also driving those thoughts in the first place. If you don't buy that, then I think you should buy this experiment that we did to address some of the reviewers' concerns about the original paper. And here, what we did is we took a group of healthy participants, we put them in the scanner, and we said, imagine playing tennis. This drove the premotor activity just as it had previously. We then said, now, please do not follow the instructions that you're about to hear. And we said, imagine playing tennis. Exactly the same instruction this time produces no activity relative to rest. And that's quite an important result because it shows that this is not an automatic response. Just being told to imagine playing tennis doesn't automatically fire off your premotor cortex. You have to do it. You have to obey the instruction and go through the process of thinking about being on a tennis court, and waving your arms around. And again, I think this is an interesting idea because here you have, unlike the original tennis experiment, here you have 2 absolutely identical situations. The participant has received exactly the same instructions, at least immediately prior to the thing we're trying to measure, yet 2 different mental states are produced, and we are able to decode those mental states to decide which of these 2 things the person has done. And we've played with that idea in a number of different contexts over the years. This is just to show you that this is not a one-off. We've seen many patients like this now. This is examples of 10 patients diagnosed as being in a vegetative state, some from back in the UK, some from here in Canada that we've seen over the years. About 17% of the patients that we see that appear to be entirely vegetative, actually, when you put them in the scanner, can do these tasks. This is not just data from my lab. Last year, a meta-analysis was published of all of the labs around the world that have now done this and approached these patients with this task, and 20% is the number that comes out there. Wherever you do this, about 1 in 5 patients turn out to actually be aware, even though they're entirely non-responsive. And that, going back to Robert's introduction, that's why I think it's important that we work on mechanisms for decoding the mental states of these patients, because actually, when you look at the numbers, it adds up to quite a lot of people. I should have plugged sound in. Is it too late to plug a a sound. It's coming up shortly, but here it is. I'll carry on. If we can put a sound in, that would be great. So the thing we went on to do is to use this as a means of communication. And this was actually really quite a small step. It was basically to take the original task where a participant would imagine walking around the house or imagine playing tennis and say to a patient, okay, we know you can do these two things. Now do one of them to indicate a yes and do the other one to indicate a no. And the first patient we did this with successfully became known as patient 23. This was in 2010, a paper that was led by one of my postdocs, Martin Monti, came out in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2010. These actually weren't the questions we asked on the day. I've used this to illustrate a different point, but essentially the data are appropriate. This was patient 23. When asked questions like, is the current year 1999, which might have been the year of the injury, the patient imagines walking around the house because he knew that in order to indicate a no, he had to imagine walking around his house. And if you look below, this is what happened when we asked a different question, such as, is the current year 2010? Here, the classic medial premotor tennis playing activity is produced. And of course, we're now going one stage further with the decoding mental states. We don't just know that in this case, he is imagining playing tennis. We know that he is telling us that the current year is 2010. Now, obviously, he's not doing it directly. We're using this proxy, the fact that he's imagining playing tennis, to get to that information. And that's because you all know, if we just asked him, is the current year 2010, and scanned him and tried to decode that information, we wouldn't be able to tell whether he was saying yes or no, because at the moment, we can't do that with fMRI. A couple of other examples we've gone on to here in Canada. We've used this to ask patients more sort of pertinent questions about their current circumstances, like, are you in pain? This is a no response from a patient. Or do you still enjoy watching hockey? One of the unfortunate consequences of this condition is that patients get to do an awful lot of whatever it is they liked before their injury. And you can imagine if you really enjoy watching hockey and then you've been in a vegetative state for 20 years, perhaps things have changed and you don't no longer want to sit and watch 8 hours of hockey every day. And we're now able to access some of these patients and ask them about their musical choices and their TV choices and so on and so forth. So that was patient 23. We published a number of other patient stories since actually several of them are in my book, talking about what we've been able to find out about them by, and I return to this sort of idea, by decoding their mental states, but again in a very indirect way. We're basically getting them to report on their mental state by decoding a yes or a no, which is a very sort of quite a clumsy and roundabout way, I think, of decoding a mental state. But at least at the time, that was all we had available to us. I'm going to play this short video just because I love it so much, just to tell you, really to indicate just how important this work is. Uh-oh. Sorry? They might have missed the best bit. Okay, that's true. Without that. But can anybody else hear it? Okay, let's try again. Oh, I see. What a shame. Okay, I'm going to move on. Right? Questions. Okay. I'm determined to show you this. Yes. Right. Determined. I've kind of, the joke has gone, but...
Doctors recently achieved the ability to communicate with a man known as patient 23 through magnetic imaging, MRI, by prompting with questions that triggered electroactivity.
What kind of questions?
Mundane questions about housekeeping and tennis. but they unexpectedly lit up certain regions of his brain that translated to yes and no responses.
That is incredible.
It's incredible. It's incredible. They said so on the X-Files. No, that was very exciting to see. More exciting than probably any science I've ever done. So let me tell you a bit about how we got, because I think, it speaks to this decoding issue, how it is that we got to getting people to imagine playing tennis. And actually, interestingly, in the context of this workshop, it came from an EEG study that we'd conducted more than 10 years earlier. It didn't come out for years. It proved to be very difficult to publish. It came out in 2003, but this was work that we did in the mid-90s with Will Penny when he was really rather younger than he is now, of course, and people like Ingrid Johnsrud. And we just sort of had this idea that maybe we could use EEG to determine, could we decode EEG to determine what somebody was thinking of various different tasks. And this was in 10 subjects. It was 4-channel EEG, which was very exciting at the time. And what we came up with 4 tasks that were basically designed to maximally give us distance between the sort of areas that we thought they would, areas of the brain that we thought they would recruit. So, we just came up with these by thinking about what we knew about the brain. We came up with singing a familiar tune. I can't remember whether it was Christmas carols or nursery rhymes, but we had people mentally rehearse a familiar tune, assuming that would activate left inferior frontal regions. And then we had people do spatial navigation, think about moving around their house, because we imagine that would probably be a right parietal somewhere towards the back, to give us a lot of distance between the two. And then we used 2 very old and sort of well-worn EEG paradigms, getting people just to squeeze one or other hand. And then we compared all of these tasks in various combinations to find out which ones were best. And Will Penny did this very sophisticated at the time analysis, and it turned out that the hand squeezing was very poor. The best tasks that could be decoded were the imaginary singing in your head, and the spatial navigation, and the hand squeezing was very poor. So we turned immediately from there to fMRI and sort of asked the question, well, can we improve this using fMRI? So we took the 2 tasks that had worked really well, the spatial navigation and the auditory task, and then we tried to sort of basically just amp up the motor imagery. The idea was, well, maybe squeezing your hand or doing fine finger movements isn't good enough. Let's get people to really wave their arms around or imagine waving their arms around. That's where we came up with the idea of getting people to think about playing a game of tennis, because it's a sort of a simple vehicle for getting people around the idea of what they wanted to do. And this worked in this experiment, this was from Melanie Bowley, who was visiting me in Cambridge from Stephen Laurie's lab around 2005, 2006. This worked spectacularly well. As you can see from this study, it was very, very clear the difference between, in this case, it's motor imagery, imagine playing tennis task, and the spatial navigation task. And this is, I think, why we sort of switched at that point. Even though this whole journey started with EEG, I think this is why we switched over to using fMRI, because it was just so obvious. And I don't think it was so obvious because of any sort of sophisticated analysis. It's just that when you have the anatomy and when you have the blobs on brains, it's just so clear that this is working really well in single subjects. And you don't have to know a lot about brain imaging to look at this and say, yeah, those people are all activating pretty much the same area. And of course, the important thing with this work is that it works in single subjects. Anyone can produce a group average and show that thinking about this on average activates that area of the brain. But we need something that works all the time in a single participant. And this just immediately jumped out as being very, very promising. And when you flip it around the other way and you look at spatial navigation versus motor imagery, you get exactly the same thing. You get this sort of pop out here, parahippocampal gyrus. Almost every single participant is producing activity in that region of the brain with that rather direct comparison. And again, I think this is really why the next 10 years, or for the next 10 years, we focused solely on fMRI, despite the fact that methodologically or practically it was very difficult to get patients, these types of patients, into an MRI scanner. We still focused on this because it works so well, or at least it was so easy to interpret in individual participants. And if you look at the final, this is the final figure from that paper that Melanie and I wrote. Actually came out after the science paper, but this was the figure where we sort of said, okay, these are the two tasks: spatial imagery versus motor imagery. When you compare, look just at the right hand side there, this is what that patient, in fact less than a year later, this was the first patient that appeared in that paper looked like. And it's clear that she absolutely fitted the mold really well. So that's the story of how we got to these two tasks. And as I say, it came originally from an EEG task. Over the next few years, and most of this I haven't spoken about here before. Again, it's all going to be fMRI, but we tried lots of different things to both to simplify the task and to make communication easier and to sort of get us to the next stage. This is again work by one of my then postdocs, Martin Monti, who's now at UCLA. And Martin's idea was, well, let's look at attention. Can we see switches of attention in these patients? Could we use that as a vehicle for knowing that somebody was aware? So he had a stream of words like dog, cat, field, cat, and one of the words would repeat many times, and the task was to count the number of times you heard the word cat. And the stimulus stream stayed exactly the same throughout the experiment, just a continuous stream of words. And every so often, there would be another voice that would say, listen to the words, or count the number of times you hear the word cat. Listen to the words, count the number. So stimulus stays the same, but the participant is either counting or is sort of just trying to let the words wash over them. And this is it worked very well in a patient here on the right. On the left, on the far side, a patient. We were very easily able to detect that a patient was doing this, was oscillating between just listening and counting. And then and again, it's just a sort of decoding of mental states, I suppose. We are interpreting which of these two things, or whether or not the patient is doing the two things that we have asked them to do. So again, it's driven by our instructions, and we are simply decoding whether or not they are obeying those instructions. But I would pull away from saying, we're decoding the person's mental state, because I think we're only doing that in a rather rudimentary way. Another of my then postdocs, Lorena Nachi, who's now in Dublin, sort of took this idea one stage further. First of all, she compared a similar selective attention task. This was now counting the number of times you heard a word like yes in a stream of digits. The other digits, or all the digits, were just distractors. Every so often you'd hear a yes, and the participants were asked to count the number of times they heard that, versus just sort of relax and let the whole thing wash over you. And she compared it to the tennis task, which sort of at the time was the gold standard for us, and it worked better. At the bottom row here, you're looking at the number of participants in the study for whom any given voxel was significantly activated, and you can see there that in fact I think all 12 participants in this study produced significant activity in that medial region when you compared them attending versus when they were listening, and that was even better than the tennis task is incredibly robust. Most people activate that premotor region when they play tennis, but it wasn't as good as the selective attention task. And Lorena then went on and used that to develop again a rather rudimentary way of communicating with some of our patients. And the idea was that she would start with a localizer where she would just get the patient to either attend to a stream of yes, no, yes, yes, no, 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 yes, or again, just relax and let it wash over you. That gave us localizers that gave us a region of interest that we could hone in on. And then we would tell the patient, well, you're going to hear bursts of yeses and bursts of nos, and you please attend to the word you are trying to convey. And then we would ask a question like, are you in a supermarket? And they would hear a burst of yeses and a burst of no. We would do a simple contrast between the two conditions using the localizer. And in this case, this patient is communicating that they are not in a supermarket and that they are in a hospital, because that activity is stronger in the yeses in the hospital condition. So that also worked pretty well. Again, it's kind of decoding mental states, but using using a proxy. But in some patients, this idea was very useful in allowing them to communicate information about what they understood about the situation that they were in. This is an interesting idea. So this comes from work that Martin Monti did in my lab back in Cambridge, and this was, again, sort of thinking about attentional switching. Is there something we can do with attention that could allow us to know that a patient, was aware? We know very well that face perception, when you see a face, you activate the so-called fusiform face area. And when you see a house, typically it produces activity in the parahippocampal place area. And we also knew that just imagining these things, it's a weaker signal, but just imagining seeing a face or imagining seeing a house can also produce this activity. So Martin's question was, well, if we superimpose a face and a house and we get people to switch their attention between the two, will we see a switch in activity between the parahippocampal place area and the fusiform face area? That's just an example of the sorts of stimuli that he used. The patient would lie in the scanner and we would just say, you can either see the face or you can see the house, and we want you to switch between the two. Switch every 20 or 30 seconds or so. And again, this worked remarkably well. Only in some patients, as I said at the beginning of my talk, most of these patients cannot fixate. So for most patients, this isn't really an option. But in this human brain mapping paper that Martin produced, we had an example of one patient who could do this, who could switch his attention between the face and the house. The stimulus remained absolutely static and unchanging throughout the entire scanning procedure. Yet, when you look at this, is an epoch when he's being told to focus on faces, and activity in the fusiform gyrus is going up, and activity in the parahippocampal gyrus is going down. When you look at an epoch where he's being asked to focus on houses, exactly the opposite thing happens. Activity in the fusiform face area goes down, activity in the parahippocampal place area goes up. So again, well, maybe I will push this a little bit further. I'm slightly hesitant to say we're decoding mental states. In a way we are, but we are asking a person to do something, to enter into a mental state, and then we are determining whether they are doing that or not. That's sort of literally what I feel we're doing here. The reason I decided to push it a little bit further is because we have used this on occasions, usually in the context of trying to satisfy the media for some sort of TV show, of using this sort of idea to show them that we can decode mental states. So typically, I would sort of put a reporter into the scanner, and they would say, "Oh, try and guess whether I prefer red or white wine." And there, we're not saying switch. We just say, "Well, you tell us. Just." Start answering when you want, and if it's a yes, imagine playing tennis. And I've done this on a number of occasions now. If it's a healthy single control subject, it's pretty easy to get somebody to communicate with you in pseudo real time by just starting to imagine playing tennis at a particular point, and then you look at the bold signal, and as the premotor cortex starts to rise, you know that they're saying a yes or no. So you can sort of use this to decode mental states, but again, these are specific states that we have a specific number of possible states that we provide the person with, and we're essentially saying we're going to tell you which one of these things you are doing now. It's not we're going to say what you are doing now. It's which one of a certain set of circumscribed things you're doing. Over here for time. Yeah. So I'll just throw this in because I think this was one of the most fascinating results that we did with this type of idea. And this was from Adam Hampshire, who was, again, one of my postdocs at the time. Adam is now at Imperial College in London, always likes to push things just a little bit further than everybody else. And he said, well, if you can communicate with these patients, let's find a way of determining whether one of them can still reason. For him, that was the route to trying to ask sort of really difficult ethical questions like, do you want to live or die? If we could prove that somebody could reason, then we could maybe move in that direction. He took a very old task that Adam Baddeley developed, a sort of a reasoning task that works like this. You see a stimulus like BA, and then a weird grammatically complex sentence like A does not precede B, and you have to decide whether it's true or false. Turns out how well you can do this task correlates highly with your fluid intelligence. And the sentence, you can make the sentence easy or hard. It could say B. It could be A follows B is a sort of an easy version. So you can ramp up the difficulty of the task. What Adam did is he told the participants in the scanner to imagine the object that is in the front. And then he gave them sentences like, face does not precede house. And in that case, face does not precede house. So the correct response was to imagine a house there, because the house is in the front. Similarly, house is followed by face, same thing. The thing to do when you see that in this task is to imagine a house, because it is the thing that is in the front, in spite of the fact that it's not necessarily at the front of the sentence in every situation. Like in the first one, house does not appear first in the sentence, but is nevertheless conceptually in the front if you decode the sentence. And as you can see from those two examples, you can make this an easy reasoning task or a hard reasoning task. And it turns out that we found a patient who could do this in the scanner. And this is the patient here activating parahippocampal gyrus by imagining house in response to a sentence like face does not precede house. And obviously there are many, many trials. I'm showing you one sort of snapshot here. But what was interesting about this patient is not only could we decode that or determine maybe that he was aware and doing the task, because if you change the instruction to something else, he wouldn't produce this activity. We were also able to determine how well he could reason, because in this case, he would produce the response with something like house is followed by face. But at a certain point of difficulty, like once we got to the face does not precede house, he stopped responding. So not only were we able to determine that he could do it, we could determine how well he could reason. And in fact, he could reason about as well as most healthy people. It turns out about 1 in 7 people can't do that first sentence, or at least 1 in 7 of the participants that we had looked at. And so it was perfectly plausible that he couldn't do it either, which was nothing to do with his condition or his accident. He just, never did have the mental capacity required to solve a reasoning problem like that. So I'll finish by, I'm going to lead, my talk leads directly into what Jeff LaForge is going to follow on with, and this was sort of the last work we've really done with fMRI in these patients, and we've shifted quite heavily over to trying to do some of these things with EEG, as you're going to hear during the next couple of talks, and also something from Avital tomorrow. So this, I think, is our best attempt at actually decoding mental states, as opposed to what I've shown you previously. And this was primarily work by Louina Narchi, who, as I said, is now in Dublin. And it was very much based on work from Uri Hassan's lab. And the idea here was we thought, well, we're trying to get away from getting the patient to have to make a response. We really wanted the patient to just be themselves, do something sort of normal and see, and could, the question was, can we decode whether they're conscious or not from their normal brain patterns doing some sort of everyday activity, and that everyday activity was watching a movie. And we knew from the work from Uri's lab that when people watch some movies, or at least some movies more than others, their brains become highly synchronized. This is our data now, but this is a replication of something that Uri Hassan had done with this early Alfred Hitchcock movie. It's a shortened version of it. The story is sort of quite important. It's about a boy who finds a gun, and it's very clear to us, the audience, that the boy thinks it's a toy gun. It's also very clear to us, the audience, that it's actually a real gun. And in typical sort of Hitchcock style, the tension mounts as you become more and more convinced that the boy is going to shoot somebody. He finds some bullets, and he obviously thinks they're toy bullets, and he puts them in the gun. And then you'll see, if you keep watching, I should just sit down and we should watch this, actually. It's quite good. He starts spinning the barrel and then walking around the house, and it becomes more. But in reality, it's actually quite a tense piece of movie making. But it's conceptually quite complicated. You have to understand what a gun is for this to be scary. You have to realize yourself that it's not a toy gun, it is a real gun. You also have to have quite a bit of theory of mind, because you have to know that the kid thinks it's a toy gun. You have to work that out for yourself. And of course, there's all these sort of parts of the plot that come together. I'm going to spoil it all for you now and stop it. And so, as I said, we knew, and in our hands too, when healthy participants watch this movie, their brains become highly synchronized. So you're not looking at brain activity, you're looking at the voxels that are significantly synchronized across individuals, and many parts of the brain turn out to move in synchrony when people watch a short movie like this. Now, we know it's about the movie. It's not that all of our brains just happen to be synchronized anyway, and you wouldn't believe the number of times I've been asked that question. Because if you just scan people lying in the scanner not listening to a movie, no voxels are correlated across individuals. So we don't naturally all just sort of synchronize. You have to drive it with a strong external stimulus. In this case, it's a movie, and it's a movie with an intensely engaging plot. And the first real indication we got about the importance of the plot came when Lorena scrambled the movie. She moved the sections of the movie around, so the plot no longer made any sense. All the same visual information was there, all the same auditory information, but the plot didn't make sense. And when you do that, auditory and visual cortex remain highly synchronized across individuals, because, of course, you're all seeing and hearing all the same stuff at the same time. So again, that's not that surprising. But all the frontal and parietal activity drops away, or the frontal and parietal the synchronization in frontal and parietal cortex drops away. And that was our first indication that these areas are really what are driving our understanding or our following of the plot. But we want to do something a little bit more sophisticated to really sort of nail this down. So we used ICA, independent component analysis, and we broke down the activity across participants into a series of components. Of course, there's a very strong auditory component. There's a lot of important auditory information going on in the brain. There's a strong visual component, but what we're really interested in is this frontoparietal component, and could we somehow relate this to the plot? And you can see, I think, if you haven't heard me talk about this before, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. The idea is that if we can show that a patient is following the plot of a movie, there is no reason to suppose they can't follow the plot of their own lives, because in many cases, a movie is kind of like real life. Maybe not an Alfred Hitchcock movie for most of us, but that was the idea. Is can we get to the point that we can conclude that this patient is following a series of events and understanding people's motivations and understanding making predictions about what is likely to happen and remembering things that have happened previously and relating them to the future. Time traveling, this experience that we have when we're engrossed in a real movie, and indeed when we are engrossed in our own lives. So to get at that, we came up with a quantitative and a qualitative sort of estimate of how engaging the movie was. And this was, again, to try and work out what the frontal and parietal lobes are doing during this task. So this was a very simple experiment. We took a separate group of participants, not in a scanner, sitting watching the movie in the lab, and we got them to do the sustained attention to response task, which simply involves pressing a button every time you hear a digit and avoiding pressing a button when you hear a particular digit. In this case, it was the number 8, I think. And it's a surprisingly difficult task. You should try this at home. I mean, even if you watch a really good movie, even if you just try to tap the table every second, what happens is as the movie gets more and more engaging, you just sort of stop. And then you remember and you carry on and you sort of get back into it. And then the movie gets engaging and you just sort of stop. It's really hard to do the two things at the same time. And the SART task is just a slightly more formalized version of tapping your finger while watching a movie. And so what this allowed us to do by getting a group of participants to do this was to get a measure of how engaging the movie was at every frame of the movie, because essentially we looked at how accurate or how accurately people were tapping on average as they watched the movie. And it turned out that so in red there, you're looking at the frontoparietal component. This is from the group of participants who are lying in the scanner. This is watching the movie. In green, you're looking at frontoparietal activity in that group that is predicted by SART performance in group 2. So it is how does your performance on the SART task outside of the scanner predict activity in a separate group of individuals inside the scanner? It turns out, you can see from the yellow overlap, they're really quite highly related. That how engaging the movie is in terms of how much it is how much your SART performance is affected is highly related to frontoparietal activity in a separate group of individuals. The other way, it's just a sentence to saying exactly what I've just said. The other way was to just get people, I mean, ideally we wanted to say to people, how executively demanding is the movie right now? But when you say that to people, they don't know what you're talking about. So we got people to say how engaging or how I can't remember the word we used, how gripping the movie is or something, that they just had a little sort of, they just rated every few seconds how engaging the movie was. And again, we used that as a regressor with the separate group. So again, that was in a group of participants outside the scanner. We used that as a regressor on the participants who were in the scanner. And we showed that we were able to predict very highly frontoparietal activity on a separate group of participants inside the scanner based on how gripping a separate group of participants rated the movie to be whilst outside the scanner. How engaging the plot is rated by one group of individuals. It predicted frontoparietal activity in another group of individuals. And that essentially is the tool that we used to start trying to mentally decode in patients whether or not their experience of the movie was similar to the experience that the rest of us are having. And you're going to hear a lot about this in the next presentation as well. But this is essentially what we were trying to do, to get closer to answering the question, what is it like to be in this condition? Rather than say, can this person produce this response that we've asked them to produce? We're really trying to say, to what extent is the pattern of brain activity when they're having this experience the same as the pattern of activity that I am having when I'm having that experience? And to what extent does that mean this person is experiencing the same thing? And I'm not sure we've quite got there. We've shown that this is workable in patients now. So this was from Lorena's PNS paper, where she took 2 patients who were clinically very similar, and she basically put them in the scanner, had them watch the movie, and then tried to, essentially looked at what voxels in that patient's brain could be predicted by things like SART performance of healthy participants, how gripping healthy participants rated movies to be, and indeed what healthy participants how healthy participants' brains responded during the movie. And what she showed is the two patients dissociated very nicely. So patient one, the auditory component appeared to be intact. So that is the patient's brain, the auditory, the activity that was related to changes in the auditory signal was still responding. And this I don't find very surprising. When a gun goes off, all of our brains are going to the auditory areas in all of our brains are all going to respond at exactly the same time. And we know from work that I haven't told you about, that means absolutely nothing about whether we are conscious or not in patients. We see it very, very often. In more than 50% of patients that we see, you'll get intact auditory responses, even to quite complex auditory stimuli. But there was nothing in the frontoparietal component. But the second patient, who was clinically very similar, we could predict based on, and I think I put a list here just so I get it right. So the second patient's frontoparietal activity was predicted by the time course of the frontoparietal ICA from healthy participants, and from how attentionally demanding the movie had been in healthy individuals, and how engaging it had been rated by healthy individuals. And I think this is my final slide. This is as close as we've come, I think, with fMRI to sort of decoding mental states. My feeling from this is that this patient is having the same experience of the movie as I am. I feel reasonably confident that I can conclude that this patient actually went on to be able to imagine playing tennis and do other tasks. So subsequently, we know that this is a conscious person, despite the fact that he's entirely behaviourally non-responsive. But I'm more interested in and we can. This is. I hope very much that we talk about this in discussion at this meeting. I feel like I want to conclude that this person's experience, we've decoded the mental state to the point that this person's mental experience is likely to be pretty similar to mine. And the reason that we haven't pushed further with this is rather a practical one, that, as I alluded to earlier, getting patients to the scanner is complicated, getting them into the scanner is complicated, we have to transport them around the place. And once we got this far, it sort of seemed obvious that we had to return to portable, cost-effective techniques. Can we do this some other way, so we can just sort of rock up at the patient's house and find out that they're conscious, and maybe turn this into some sort of form of communication? And that was not something that I felt was going to go much further using fMRI, given the expense and the non-portability. So what you're going to hear about, I'll finish there, and I've probably missed out all sorts of people, but I've tried to include almost everybody that contributed to anything I've said today. I'm going to now go on and let Jeff Laforge talk, and just to sort of by way of introduction, Jeff is a graduate student in my lab. He's a first-year PhD student. So he's going to be talking about his master's work, which he also did, supervised by Bobby Sternowski, working in my lab at Western. And really his remit was, well, go and do this with EEG. That's essentially what it was. And I'm not afraid to say I thought it was going to be much easier than it turned out to be, and that's very much why I'm here today, and why I think we can all benefit from sharing our experiences of trying to understand and interpret EEG data, because I'm sure once you've heard Jeff's talk and you've seen what I've talked about with fMRI, the sorts of many of the issues that come out of these different methodologies and how we use them to decode mental states, I think will be a lot clearer. So thank you very much for listening. I will hand over to Jeff.